Margaret Chung stood at the bus stop on Fifth Avenue, clutching her worn leather purse against her chest. The evening wind was getting colder, and she pulled her old cardigan tighter around her shoulders. After 3 bus rides and 45 minutes of travel, she was finally here. The golden lights of Steinway Hall glowed before her like something from a fairy tale. She had been saving for this moment for 8 months. Every week she would put away $20 from her hospital cleaning job. $20 might not sound like much, but when you're earning minimum wage and supporting yourself in a tiny apartment, every dollar counts. The ticket cost her $160, but she knew it would be worth it. Classical music had been her escape since childhood, and tonight she would finally hear it performed live in one of the city's most famous concert halls. Margaret took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. The marble steps felt different under her practical black shoes compared to the expensive heels clicking around her. She noticed how the other guests moved with confidence, their voices carrying stories of recent vacations and business deals. Women in silk dresses and men in perfectly tailored suits chatted easily while sipping champagne from crystal glasses. At the entrance, a young woman in a black uniform checked tickets. When Margaret handed over her printed ticket, the girl barely glanced at her before pointing toward the main hall. Margaret smiled and said thank you, but the girl was already looking at the next person in line. Inside the concert hall, Margaret felt her breath catch. The ceiling stretched high above her, decorated with intricate golden designs that seemed to dance in the warm light. Red velvet seats filled the space in perfect rows, and at the front, a magnificent black piano sat on stage like a sleeping giant. She had seen pictures of places like this, but being here in person was completely different. Her seat was in the back row, which was exactly what she expected for the price she paid. As she made her way down the aisle, she noticed how conversations seemed to pause when she passed. Not in a welcoming way, but more like people were wondering if she had wandered into the wrong place. Margaret kept her head high and found her seat, placing her purse carefully on her lap. The woman sitting next to her wore a diamond necklace that probably cost more than Margaret made in a year. She was talking to her companion about their recent trip to Paris, where they had attended opera performances and visited art galleries. Margaret listened quietly, imagining what it would be like to travel to such places. The woman never acknowledged Margaret's presence, not even when Margaret accidentally bumped her elbow while settling into her seat during the pre-show announcements. Margaret learned that tonight's featured performer was Viktor Petrov, a famous Russian pianist known around the world for his incredible skill and intense performances. The program mentioned his numerous awards and his reputation for being extremely demanding about musical perfection. Margaret felt a thrill of excitement. She had listened to his recordings many times on her old radio at home, but tonight she would hear him play in person. As the lights dimmed and the audience fell silent, Margaret forgot about her simple navy dress and her worn cardigan. She forgot about the expensive clothes around her and the way people had looked at her. All that mattered was the music that was about to begin. The Maestro walked onto the stage with confident steps, his black hair swept back and his formal clothes perfectly pressed. He bowed to the audience, then sat at the piano bench with the grace of someone who had done this thousands of times. Margaret leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss a single note. During the first piece, a complex work by Rachmaninoff, Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. Every note seemed to tell a story, every pause held meaning. She thought about her grandmother, who had first introduced her to classical music when she was just 7 years old. Her grandmother had an old upright piano in her living room, and every Sunday after church she would play for Margaret while teaching her about the great composers. "Music is not about how much money you have or where you come from," her grandmother used to say. "Music is about what you feel in your heart." Margaret had never forgotten those words. Even through all the years of working multiple jobs and struggling to make ends meet, when the first half of the concert ended and intermission began, Margaret remained in her seat while others moved toward the lobby for refreshments. She couldn't afford the expensive drinks and snacks, but more than that, she felt comfortable in her seat. Surrounded by the lingering echoes of the beautiful music around her, conversations resumed with energy. She overheard a group of women discussing their children's private music lessons and upcoming recitals at exclusive schools. Another group talked about their summer homes in the Hamptons and their plans for attending music festivals in Europe. Margaret listened with interest, not with jealousy, but with curiosity about lives so different from her own. A man in an expensive suit turned to his wife and said, "The acoustics in this hall are almost as good as the one we heard in Vienna last month." His wife nodded and replied, "Yes, but nothing compares to that private concert we attended at the ambassador's residence." Margaret imagined what it would be like to have such experiences, to travel the world following music from one beautiful venue to another. Despite feeling out of place, Margaret didn't regret being here. This was her world too, even if others didn't see it that way. Music belonged to everyone who loved it, not just those who could afford expensive clothes and multiple concert tickets. She had grown up listening to classical music on an old radio, learning to appreciate the way melodies could express emotions that words couldn't capture. Her grandmother had taught her to play simple pieces on that old piano. And even though Margaret never had formal lessons, she had continued practicing whenever she could find access to a piano. Sometimes at the community center, sometimes at the hospital during her breaks when no one was around. Her technique wasn't perfect, but her love for music was genuine and deep. As the lights dimmed again and people returned to their seats, Margaret felt grateful for this opportunity. She had worked extra shifts and saved every penny to be here, and it was worth every sacrifice. The second half of the concert was about to begin, and she was ready to lose herself in the music once again. The maestro returned to the stage, and Margaret noticed how his presence seemed to command immediate attention and respect. She wondered what it would feel like to have such confidence, to walk into any room knowing that your talent spoke for itself. Perhaps someday she would find her own way to share her love of music with others, even if it wasn't on a stage like this. For now, though, she was content to listen, to learn, and to dream. The music was about to begin again, and Margaret Chun, the simple lady in the back row, was exactly where she belonged. The second half of the concert began with Viktor Petrov choosing one of the most challenging pieces in classical music. Margaret recognized it immediately as Liszt's Piano Sonata in B minor, a piece that demanded everything from a pianist. She had listened to recordings of this sonata countless times, but hearing it live was something entirely different. The maestro's fingers moved across the keys with incredible speed and precision. Margaret watched in amazement as he navigated the complex passages that would challenge even the most skilled musicians. The music filled every corner of the concert hall, from the softest whispers to the most powerful thunderous sections. Everyone in the audience seemed to hold their breath during the quiet moments, afraid to disturb the magic happening on stage. Margaret found herself completely lost in the performance. She forgot about her uncomfortable seat, forgot about the expensive clothes surrounding her, forgot about everything except the incredible music flowing from the piano. This was why she had saved for months to be here. This was why she worked extra shifts and skipped meals to afford the ticket. About 15 minutes into the piece, something unexpected happened. During one of the most intense passages, there was a sudden loud crack that echoed through the entire hall. The sound was so sharp and unexpected that several people in the audience gasped. Viktor Petrov's hands immediately stopped moving, and the beautiful music came to an abrupt halt. The maestro stood up quickly and looked inside the piano. His face, which had been calm and focused just moments before, now showed clear concern. He beckoned to someone backstage, and within seconds, a man in a dark suit hurried onto the stage. Margaret could see them talking quietly, but their body language told her that something was seriously wrong. The man examined the inside of the piano while Viktor Petrov stood beside him, clearly frustrated. After a few minutes of inspection, the man shook his head and spoke to the maestro. Even from her seat in the back row, Margaret could see the maestro's shoulders slump with disappointment. An uncomfortable silence filled the concert hall. People began whispering to each other, wondering what was happening. The woman next to Margaret leaned toward her companion and said, I hope this doesn't take too long. We have dinner reservations at 9:30. Finally, the event coordinator, a woman, in her 50s wearing a burgundy dress, walked onto the stage. She approached the microphone with obvious reluctance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying a note of apology, "I'm afraid we have encountered a technical difficulty with our piano. One of the strings has snapped, and our piano technician has informed us that the instrument cannot be safely played for the remainder of the evening." A wave of disappointed murmurs swept through the audience. Margaret felt her heart sink. She had been so looking forward to hearing the rest of the performance. This was her one chance to experience live classical music at this level, and now it was being cut short. The coordinator continued, "We sincerely apologize for this unexpected interruption. Tickets for tonight's performance will be refunded, and we hope you'll join us for future events." She paused, clearly uncomfortable with having to deliver this news to such a distinguished audience. People began reaching for their coats and purses, preparing to leave. Margaret heard complaints around her about wasted evenings and ruined plans. The man who had mentioned Vienna earlier was telling his wife that this would never happen at the concert halls in Europe. Margaret felt a deep sadness not just for herself, but for all the people who would miss out on the rest of the beautiful music. But then the coordinator spoke again, her voice uncertain. "Before we conclude tonight's event, I want to ask if there might be anyone in our audience who would be willing to perform on our backup piano." She gestured toward a smaller, older-looking piano that sat in the corner of the stage. Margaret had noticed it earlier but assumed it was just decoration. The coordinator's request was met with complete silence. Margaret looked around and saw people shaking their heads or looking at their phones. The idea of performing in front of such a sophisticated audience seemed to terrify even those who might have some musical ability. "I understand this is an unusual request," the coordinator continued, "but we have this beautiful instrument available, and perhaps someone would be willing to share their musical talents with us." Her voice carried a note of desperation now. Margaret could tell that the woman was trying everything she could think of to salvage the evening. The silence stretched on uncomfortably. Margaret felt her heart starting to race. She thought about her grandmother's old piano and all the hours she had spent playing it. She thought about the pieces she had learned over the years, not through formal lessons but through pure love of the music. She thought about how music had gotten her through the hardest times in her life. Around her, people were becoming restless. Some were already standing up to leave. The woman next to her was putting on her coat, clearly done with the entire evening. Margaret heard someone behind her say, "This is ridiculous. I didn't pay good money to listen to amateurs." Margaret's hands were trembling as she thought about the possibility of volunteering. She had never performed in front of more than a few people at a time. The idea of playing for hundreds of people, especially such a refined audience, terrified her. But at the same time, she felt a pull toward the stage that she couldn't ignore. She thought about her grandmother's words about music coming from the heart. She thought about all the times she had played alone in her apartment, using music to express feelings she couldn't put into words. She thought about how much joy it had brought her over the years, and how maybe, just maybe, she could bring a little of that joy to others. The coordinator made one final appeal. "We understand that this is asking a lot, but music is about sharing something beautiful with others. If anyone feels moved to help us end this evening with music, we would be deeply grateful." Margaret's pulse was racing now. She could feel sweat on her palms despite the cool air in the concert hall. Every logical part of her mind was telling her to stay in her seat, to not make a fool of herself in front of all these sophisticated people. But there was another voice in her head, her grandmother's voice, telling her that music was meant to be shared. Very slowly, Margaret raised her hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable at first, but it felt like the bravest thing she had ever done. The coordinator, who had been scanning the audience hopefully, spotted the movement and looked directly at Margaret. "Yes? Did someone volunteer?" the coordinator asked, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Margaret's voice was barely audible when she spoke. I could try to play something." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth as if someone else was speaking them. Suddenly, hundreds of eyes were looking at her. Margaret felt the weight of their attention and almost changed her mind. But then she thought about the music that had been cut short, about the beauty that had been interrupted, and about her grandmother who had taught her that music was for everyone. The moment Margaret raised her hand, time seemed to stop. Every conversation in the concert hall died down as people turned to look at her. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on her simple navy dress and worn cardigan. Her heart was beating so fast she was sure everyone could hear it. The coordinator's face lit up with relief and surprise. "Wonderful! Please come up to the stage," she said, gesturing toward Margaret with genuine enthusiasm. But Margaret noticed that her voice also carried a hint of uncertainty, as if she was wondering what kind of performance they were about to witness. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her. The woman next to her, who had been putting on her coat, stopped and stared. "Are you serious?" she whispered, not trying to hide her shock. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. As Margaret began making her way toward the stage, she could hear whispers following her path. "Who is she?" someone asked. "I've never seen her at these events before," another voice replied. "This should be interesting," said a third person. And Margaret couldn't tell if they meant it kindly or not. The walk down the aisle felt like it took forever. Margaret's practical black shoes made soft clicking sounds on the marble floor, a stark contrast to the expensive heels she had heard earlier. With each step, she became more aware of how different she looked from everyone else. Her cardigan suddenly felt shabby, and she wished she had been able to afford something nicer for this evening. Victor Petrov, the Maestro, watched her approach with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed irritation. His arms were crossed, and his expression clearly showed that he thought this was going to be a waste of everyone's time. Margaret could see him checking his expensive watch, probably calculating how much longer this interruption would take. When Margaret reached the stage, she had to climb a small set of stairs. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped the railing. The coordinator met her at the top with an encouraging smile, but Margaret could see the worry in her eyes. "Thank you so much for volunteering," she said quietly. "What would you like to play?" Margaret's mind went blank for a moment. She had spent so many hours playing different pieces over the years, but suddenly she couldn't think of a single one. The stage lights were brighter than she had expected, and the audience looked enormous from up here. She could see faces in the first few rows clearly, and most of them looked skeptical or impatient. I think I'll play some Chopin," Margaret finally managed to say. It was the first composer that came to mind, and she knew several of his pieces well enough to play them without sheet music. The coordinator nodded and stepped back, giving Margaret space to approach the piano. The backup piano was smaller than the grand piano that Victor Petrov had been using, but it was still beautiful. The wood was a rich brown color, and the keys were ivory that had yellowed slightly with age. Margaret could tell it was an older instrument, but it had been well cared for. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their familiar weight and texture. As she adjusted the bench to the right height, Margaret became acutely aware of how quiet the audience had become, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and expectant. She could sense that most people were waiting for her to fail, to prove that she didn't belong on this stage. Some people were already pulling out their phones, probably planning to leave the moment she started playing. Victor Petrov had moved to the side of the stage where he could watch her performance. His expression was stern, and Margaret could feel his professional judgment weighing on her. She knew that he was probably thinking about how this amateur was going to embarrass herself and waste everyone's time. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. She thought about her grandmother's living room, about Sunday afternoons spent learning to play simple melodies. She thought about all the evenings she had spent at her small apartment, playing quietly so she wouldn't disturb the neighbors. She thought about how music had been her companion through lonely times and her celebration during happy moments. The first notes she played were soft and hesitant. It was the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she had learned years ago and played countless times. but her fingers felt stiff with nervousness, and she was painfully aware of every small imperfection in her technique. Someone in the audience coughed, and Margaret almost stopped playing. She could feel sweat on her forehead despite the cool air in the concert hall. Part of her wanted to stand up, apologize, and return to her seat. But then she remembered why she was here. She remembered the joy that music had brought to her life, and she thought about how the evening's beautiful performance had been cut short. Gradually, as she continued playing, Margaret began to feel more comfortable. The familiar melody helped calm her nerves, and she started to forget about the audience watching her. The notes began to flow more naturally, and she found herself playing with more confidence. This was a piece she knew by heart, a piece that had comforted her during difficult times. As the music continued, Margaret noticed that the restless sounds from the audience had stopped. The coughing and whispering had died down, and people seemed to be actually listening. She risked a quick glance at the audience and saw that some people had settled back into their seats. Instead of preparing to leave, the nocturne was a perfect choice for this moment. It was gentle and lyrical, not showing off with flashy techniques, but speaking directly to the heart. Margaret had always loved how Chopin could express deep emotions through relatively simple melodies. She let herself get lost in the music, playing each phrase with the feeling it deserved. Viktor Petrov, who had been standing with his arms crossed, slowly let his hands drop to his sides. His expression was changing from annoyance to something that looked like surprise. Margaret couldn't see his face clearly from where she sat, but she could sense that his attention had shifted from checking his watch to actually listening to what she was playing. The woman in the front row who had been looking at her phone put it away and leaned forward slightly. An elderly man who had been whispering to his wife fell silent and closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Even the coordinator, who had been fidgeting nervously at the side of the stage, stood still and listened. Margaret reached the most beautiful part of the nocturne, where the melody rises and falls like gentle waves. This was the section that always moved her most deeply, and she played it with all the emotion she felt. Her technique might not be perfect, but her love for the music was genuine and pure. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, Margaret smiled slightly. She was doing what she had always done, sharing the music that lived in her heart. The difference was that tonight, instead of playing for an empty apartment, she was playing for a room full of people who were actually listening. As Margaret continued playing the Chopin Nocturne, something magical began to happen in the concert hall. The music seemed to wrap around everyone like a warm blanket, and the atmosphere in the room completely changed. What had started as polite but skeptical attention was transforming into something deeper. Margaret herself was changing too. The nervousness that had made her hands shake was melting away with each note she played. Her fingers were finding their natural rhythm, and she was beginning to play not just the notes on the page, but the emotions behind them. This was the way she had always played when she was alone, letting the music tell its own story. The nocturne reached its most tender section, where the melody seems to whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. Margaret had always imagined this part as a gentle conversation between old friends, and that's exactly how she played it. Her touch on the keys was soft but sure, bringing out the sweetness in every phrase. Viktor Petrov found himself taking a step closer to the piano. He had been prepared to endure an embarrassing amateur performance, but what he was hearing was something entirely different. This woman's technique wasn't perfect. He could hear that clearly. But there was something in her playing that many of his professionally trained colleagues had lost along the way. She was playing with her whole heart. The maestro had spent decades listening to pianists who could execute the most difficult pieces flawlessly. He had worked with students who could play faster, louder, and with more technical precision than this simple woman in her worn cardigan. But technical perfection wasn't everything. What mattered most was the ability to make people feel something, and Margaret was doing exactly that. As the nocturne drew to a close, Margaret surprised everyone by seamlessly transitioning into another piece. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune, but not the version most people knew. She was playing her own arrangement, one she had developed over years of playing alone in her apartment. She had simplified some of the more complex passages while adding her own touches to make the melody even more expressive. Victor Petrov's eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. This wasn't just someone playing pieces from memory, this was someone who understood music deeply enough to make it her own. He watched as Margaret's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, painting musical pictures with every phrase. The audience was completely silent now, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence from earlier. This was the kind of silence that happens when people are truly moved by what they're experiencing. Margaret could feel the change in the room, even though she was focused on the music. The tension and skepticism had disappeared, replaced by something much warmer. An elderly woman in the third row closed her eyes and let a single tear roll down her cheek. The music was reminding her of her late husband, who used to play piano for her when they were young. A businessman who had been checking his email put away his phone and found himself completely absorbed in the gentle melody. Even the teenagers, who had been dragged to the concert by their parents, stopped fidgeting and listened with genuine interest. Margaret's arrangement of Clair de Lune was like nothing Victor Petrov had ever heard before. She had taken Debussy's already beautiful piece and somehow made it even more personal and intimate. The way she used the sustained pedal created a dreamy, floating quality that made the music seem to hang in the air like moonlight itself. The maestro realized he was witnessing something rare, a musician who played not for fame or recognition, but purely for the love of music. He had almost forgotten that such musicians existed. In his world of concert halls and recording contracts, music had sometimes become more about competition than about touching people's hearts. As Margaret moved through the flowing passages of Clair de Lune, she began to add subtle variations that weren't in the original piece. She would slow down at certain moments to let a beautiful harmony linger, or speed up slightly to create a sense of gentle urgency. These weren't mistakes. They were the choices of someone who understood that music was a living, breathing art form. Victor Petrov found himself studying Margaret's technique more carefully. Her posture wasn't perfect according to classical standards, and her fingering wasn't always what a piano teacher would recommend. But there was something natural and unforced about the way she played. She wasn't fighting the music or trying to prove anything. She was simply letting it flow through her. The coordinator, who had been worried about how this unconventional performance might be received, was amazed by what she was witnessing. The audience was more engaged than they had been during the original professional performance. People were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in the music. Some were smiling, others looked deeply moved, and a few were wiping away tears. Margaret's version of Clair de Lune was reaching its most beautiful section, where the melody rises and falls like gentle waves. She played this part with such tenderness that it seemed to touch something deep inside everyone listening. The music wasn't just entertainment, it was a shared, emotional experience that connected every person in the room. Victor Petrov realized that his own approach to performing had become too focused on perfection and not enough on connection. Watching Margaret play reminded him of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about impressing people with technical skill. It was about sharing something beautiful and meaningful. As the piece continued, Margaret began to improvise slightly, adding her own musical ideas to Debussy's framework. She would repeat a phrase with slight variations or extend a melody in a way that felt natural and expressive. This wasn't showing off. It was the mark of a true musician who understood that music was meant to be a conversation between the performer and the audience. The woman who had been sitting next to Margaret in the back row was now watching with complete amazement. She had dismissed Margaret as someone who didn't belong in this sophisticated environment. But now she was witnessing one of the most moving musical performances she had ever experienced. She felt ashamed of her earlier judgment and impressed by Margaret's courage. Victor Petrov could see that Margaret was completely lost in the music now. She was no longer nervous or self-conscious. She was in that special place that all true musicians know, the place where technique serves emotion, where the music plays itself, and where the performer becomes a channel for something larger than themselves. The maestro realized that he was learning something important from this unexpected performance. Margaret was teaching him that authenticity was more valuable than perfection, that heart was more important than technique, and that music was meant to bring people together, not to create distance between performer and audience. As Claire de Lune reached its gentle conclusion, the entire concert hall seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's hands moved through the final phrases with such grace and feeling that even Viktor Petrov felt moved in a way he hadn't experienced in years. This simple woman had reminded everyone in the room why music mattered. As Margaret played the final, delicate notes of her improvised medley, the last sounds seemed to float in the air like whispers. Her hands rested gently on the keys for a moment, and she took a deep breath. The silence that followed was different from any silence she had ever experienced. It wasn't empty or uncomfortable. It was full of something beautiful and shared. For several heartbeats, nobody in the concert hall moved. Margaret sat at the piano bench, suddenly aware of where she was again. The stage lights felt warm on her face, and she could see the audience clearly now. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, but their expressions had completely changed from when she had first walked onto the stage. Then, from the side of the stage came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Viktor Petrov was applauding, his hands coming together in a steady rhythm that echoed through the silent hall. His face, which had shown such skepticism and irritation earlier, now displayed something Margaret had never expected to see: genuine respect and admiration. The maestro's applause seemed to break a spell over the audience. One by one, people began to join in, and within moments the entire concert hall erupted in thunderous applause. But this wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that often follows performances. This was the kind of applause that comes from the heart, the kind that says, "Thank you for sharing something beautiful with us." Margaret sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. She had never heard applause like this before. People weren't just clapping, they were standing up. The woman who had been sitting next to her in the back row was on her feet, clapping enthusiastically. The businessman who had been checking his phone was standing and applauding with tears in his eyes. Even the teenagers who had seemed bored earlier were clapping and smiling. Viktor Petrov stepped forward, still applauding, and Margaret could see that his expression had completely transformed. The annoyance and impatience were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. He approached the piano as the applause continued to fill the hall, and Margaret wasn't sure what to expect when the maestro reached her. He stopped clapping and extended his hand to help her stand. Margaret took his hand, still feeling shaky from the experience, and rose from the piano bench. Viktor Petrov looked directly into her eyes, and she could see genuine warmth there. "In 30 years of professional performance," he said, his accented voice carrying clearly despite the ongoing applause, "I have rarely heard music played with such authentic feeling." His words were simple, but Margaret could tell he meant every one of them. What you just shared with us was not just technical skill, it was pure music from the heart. Margaret felt her eyes filling with tears. She had never expected such words from someone of his stature. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely audible over the continued applause. "I just just love music so much." Viktor Petrov smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "That love, that is what makes a true musician. May I ask where you studied?" "Your arrangement of Debussy was extraordinary." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "I never had formal lessons," she admitted. "My grandmother taught me basics when I was young, and I've been playing on my own ever since. I work as a cleaner at the hospital, and I practice whenever I can find a piano." The maestro's eyebrows raised in amazement. "You developed that musical understanding without formal training? That is remarkable. That kind of intuitive musicality cannot be taught. It is a gift." He paused, seeming to consider something important. "I would very much like to stay in touch with you. There are opportunities I think you should know about." As their conversation continued, the applause finally began to die down, but people weren't leaving. Instead, they were gathering at the front of the stage, wanting to speak with Margaret. The coordinator approached with a huge smile on her face, clearly thrilled with how the evening had turned out. "That was absolutely incredible," she said to Margaret. "I've been organizing events here for 15 years, and I've never seen an audience respond like that. Would you be willing to speak with some of our patrons? Many of them would love to meet you." Over the next 30 minutes, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who wanted to share how her music had affected them. The elderly woman who had cried during the performance told Margaret that the music had reminded her of her late husband and brought her comfort. The businessman explained that he had been having a difficult week, and her playing had helped him remember what was truly important in life. A woman who taught at a local music school approached Margaret with particular enthusiasm. "I run a community program that provides music lessons for people who can't afford private instruction," she explained. "Would you be interested in helping us? Not as a student, as a teacher. You have something special that our students need to learn." Margaret was overwhelmed by the response. People were offering her opportunities she had never dreamed possible. A local newspaper writer wanted to feature her story. Someone mentioned connections to music therapy programs at hospitals. Others talked about community concerts and local performance opportunities. Viktor Petrov stayed nearby during these conversations, occasionally adding his own endorsements of Margaret's abilities. "She has reminded me tonight why I fell in love with music," he told one group of patrons. "Sometimes the most profound teachers come from the most unexpected places." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Margaret found herself walking toward the exit with a small group that included Viktor Petrov and the coordinator. Her simple navy dress and worn cardigan didn't look out of place anymore. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there when she arrived. The Maestro handed her a business card. "I meant what I said about staying in touch," he told her. "I perform at various venues throughout the year, and I think there could be opportunities for collaboration. More importantly, there are programs that help musicians like you develop their gifts while maintaining their authentic voice." Margaret looked at the card, hardly believing this was really happening. "I still can't believe this evening turned out this way," she said. "When I raised my hand, I was terrified." The best performances often come from moments when we overcome our fear to share something meaningful, Viktor Petrov replied. "You did more than perform tonight. You reminded all of us what music is really about." As Margaret walked to the bus stop, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in just a few hours. She was still the same person who worked night shifts at the hospital and lived in a small apartment. But now she knew that her music had value, that it could touch people's hearts and bring them together. The business card in her purse represented possibilities she had never imagined. The connections she had made tonight could lead to opportunities to share her love of music with others. But most importantly, she had learned that authenticity and passion were more powerful than perfect technique or expensive clothes. The next morning, the local newspaper would feature Margaret's story on the front page. The community music center would call to offer her a position teaching piano to children whose families couldn't afford private lessons. But even more than these concrete opportunities, Margaret had gained something invaluable: the knowledge that her gifts mattered, that music truly was for everyone, and that sometimes the most beautiful performances come from the most unexpected places. As she waited for the bus that would take her home, Margaret smiled to herself. Tomorrow she would return to her job at the hospital, but now she would go there knowing that she was not just a cleaner. She was also a musician whose gift had moved an entire concert hall. Her grandmother had been right all along. Music really did come from the heart, and when you shared it with courage and authenticity, it could change everything.